The character we want to investigate today had an intense presence in the Argentine media for 5 long years. 5 years were enough for him to become one of the most controversial and bizarre celebrities of an era. A figure that today remains present in memes and many other aspects of popular culture. His exposure was so extreme that he recorded a video from inside a hospital. Friday, November 22nd, 2013. In this video, with a smile that couldn't quite hide some pain, he announced that he was hospitalized so they could finally cure everything they needed to cure. He also stressed his wish to fully enjoy life to the fullest. These words were a relief for many who were concerned about his restless future. The media personality had left an unfavorable impression in recent days. While in Miami, he used social media to say he was returning to Buenos Aires due to serious health concerns. With a bitter tone, he had written that it was his last peaceful afternoon in that North American city that he liked so much and that had been the scene of many of his adventures. The operating rooms had severely impacted his integrity, which was widely known. A knee injury dating back to 2009 had made him suffer more than 6 surgeries and had exposed many other problems. Who had previously shown in front of cameras dancing and wearing extravagant and expensive outfits, had been photographed with canes and looking somewhat worse for wear. Of course, the paparazzi had made sure to portray him in the least convenient way to feed the public's morbid curiosity, who didn't want to miss a single detail of what was happening with the businessman. Why was it so exciting and hypnotic to watch him? Simple, because he was a subject in which it was difficult to differentiate where the person ended and where the character began. In addition, he was able to switch from the most recalcitrant egocentrism to a sad and almost melancholic pose. Without going any further, in his last months, he had given a few interviews where he had abandoned frivolous topics to philosophize about death. However, the message from the clinic seemed clear. The man, at last, was ready to face a new stage. Some even began to speculate about what would be the next step in his chaotic and unpredictable career. To everyone's surprise, that next step would never come. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. How did the son of a successful businessman renounce his legacy to pursue a career in show business? Was it hard for him to start, or was it easy? What caused his spectacular fall? But more importantly, why did he manage to conquer an entire generation? To answer these and other questions, we are going to travel a long road, covered with fame, overexposure, criticism, moments of joy and moments of tragedy. And we are going to go back to November 25th of the year 2013, the day Ricardo Ford died. Ricardo produced all kinds of audiovisual material throughout his career, recordings of music videos, live choreographies, sketches, of a bunch of things. Sometimes it's hard to find them, because they are uploaded maybe in other countries and are blocked here in Argentina due to copyright issues. Ricardo Ford was born on November 5th, 1968, in a well-off family. His grandfather had shaped a company of chocolates and other sweets that had managed to make their way with more than favorable statistics. His father, determined not to waste that, had taken the reins of the Ford empire as soon as he had the chance, demonstrating his determination and a great capacity for business. And it's that Carlos Ford was a tough man, a believer that everything in life is a matter of discipline. He worked around 12 hours a day and only asked one thing of his environment: perfection. That's why, when Ricardo came into the world, Carlos set out to prepare him to become his successor. Why would anyone refuse a family business that made millions and put the clan's name in a position of power and privilege? Carlos never imagined that someone could want to renounce such a legacy. That's why, when Ricardo rebelled against his command in his early years of rebellious adolescence, the first thing he felt was enormous confusion. Ricardo had character, but didn't apply himself to the cold logic of numbers. The boy showed from the beginning a huge enthusiasm for everything that surrounded his mother's universe. Marta was a regular at visiting all the plays that premiered at the Teatro Colón. At some point, she had been a lyrical singer with promises of climbing in the show business. And that unresolved matter would not stop following her until the day of her death. The woman enjoyed the great classic tragedies while imagining herself in a world where she was the one on stage. Ricardo had felt an early empathy for his mother's dream. And soon he was more excited about going to see operas than spending time in the factory that his father used to talk about with such adoration. While Carlos was in the office, Ricardo spent hours imitating choreographies and looking at himself in a mirror, fantasizing, to conquer an audience that would applaud just by seeing the curtain open. Then, with the fall of the evening, and his dreams clouded over, and quickly, his mother asked him to help her welcome his father. When he actually arrived, the same sequence always repeated itself, inexorably. The man looked around him, unable to hide his displeasure, and he finished by announcing that he couldn't believe his son didn't even know how to properly set a table. It was clear that there was no chemistry between them, something that deepened when Ricardo turned 14. On one occasion, no longer able to hide the frustration he felt at his son's disdain for everything related to the business. Carlos asked him what he hoped to do with his life. Ricardo did not hesitate to give the answer he was waiting for, hoping he wanted to know. The other, to inherit, was the only word that came out of the young man's mouth. Although over time, Ricardo would come to assume that Carlos was a truly cultured person who knew not only about chocolates, but almost everything. He would also say that living under his roof had meant submitting to his terrible authoritarianism. That reign of terror had intensified when Ricardo confessed his homosexuality. Carlos made him feel guilty about it and never missed an opportunity to remind him that it embarrassed him more than anything in the world. "I'd rather have a drug-addicted son than a homosexual son," had been his cruel verdict. Ricardo lowered his head and began to spend more and more time at the gym, where he unloaded much of the pain it caused him, the constant struggle with his father. For a while, he believed that there was no place in the world for him, but then, thanks to a family trip, he got to know Miami and it was love at first sight. The landscape, the luxury, the young and handsome faces, the fashion, the carefree attitude of those who drove their convertibles among huge palm trees. Everything seemed tailor-made for him. The boy then had a clear goal. He was going to finish high school and leave home the next day. He planned to move to Miami to reinvent himself and experience the freedom he had been denied since his youth. At that moment, he showed that the determination of the Fords was also in his genes. When the time came, he packed a light bag, grabbed the savings that his privileged position had given him, and took a plane. He thought of nothing more than enjoying the present. He didn't know that that city would forge his destiny. Miami. Just as he had supposed, Ricardo quickly found himself like a fish in water. His physique soon made him stand out and his name began to be a constant in the Miami nightlife. Carlos had told him that he would send him money as long as he had a traditional job. Upon discovering his son's job as a nightclub dancer, he angrily decided to stop sending him any money. Marta, however, thought it was unfair and secretly started covering Ricardo's expenses in the United States behind her husband's back. Perhaps her son's decision to become a singer ignited something within her, or maybe she was doing it to oppose Carlos. Regardless, Ricardo didn't waste any time, and thanks to his contacts and his still hefty wallet, he continued to perfect his artistic skills. In a gesture of truce, Carlos introduced him to his producer friend, Palito Ortega. The singer-songwriter told Ricardo he sang well but lacked what it takes to succeed. Did the young man give up after this message dictated by a figure of authority on the subject? Not at all. He was used to no one believing that he could achieve it, so he did what he knew best. He doubled down. That's how Ricardo began to alternate long gym sessions, with more dance and singing classes, and a routine that had him visiting nightclubs from Monday to Monday. They were times of vices and endless late nights, when Ricardo constantly smiled and told anyone willing to listen. His plan to become famous. He met an older man named Gabriel, who suggested they go to Los Angeles together. He told him that he could make him succeed, and Ricardo did not hesitate. Then came the auditions, increasingly demanding rehearsals and double shifts at the gyms. It is said that around this time he met Gianni Versace, Liza Minnelli, Madonna, and Elton John, among many others. Ricardo believed luck was finally going to smile at him. However, after a few months, he realized that he was facing a new dead end. No one called him again. No one seemed interested in offering him a contract so that people could know those talents he was desperate to show. When he realized that he could get nothing more with Gabriel, he made a bold move and decided to record some demos independently. He even made a music video to promote the songs. Was it a farewell? That led him to audition for a big-time producer who ultimately chose a Puerto Rican boy who was also in the same place. It was Ricky Martin. Ricardo seemed to get to the right places, but always at the wrong time. Thus, all that effort was not in vain. His still unknown trajectory reached the ears of a woman who worked as a producer on a very particular television show. It was a late-night program in Miami that ended all its broadcasts with live shows. Renowned artists like Enrique Iglesias and Alejandro Sanz had performed there. So Ricardo could not help but feel that hope was renewed within him. He presented himself on time and in form, dazzled everyone who received him before going on air, and then gave a legendary interview in front of the cameras. In the video, he removed his shirt and discussed his aspirations. At no point did he mention his origins or the renown of his surname in his homeland. That was the most genuine Ricardo, a young man who wanted to be himself. After impressing the hosts, he gave his all to the show, performing 2 songs instead of 1. They gave him a standing ovation. Ricardo said goodbye, saying that he would soon return with a recorded album. That night, he stayed by the phone, waiting for that talent scout who seemed so elusive. He received calls from friends congratulating him. He quickly dismissed them all. Hours, days, weeks passed, and Ricardo, even though he kept visiting the recording studios, began to feel something inside him breaking. Increasingly, his father's voice began to fill his thoughts. What if the man was right? What if he was just causing embarrassment? What if he never made it? These thoughts began to erode his, until then ironclad self-confidence. One day, Ricardo turned his back on Miami to return to Argentina. And not only that, upon arriving at the family home, he sought out Carlos. Without hesitation, he declared his readiness to lead the company. He said it without stuttering, but inside him a whole world was collapsing. And that could have been the end of the story. Perhaps we would never have heard from Ricardo again, and he would have decided to continue with that legacy. It's not strange that dreams don't come true. It happens to everyone. However, Ricardo Ford was not everyone, and that's why we are now going to continue with his story. The death of the father. Over the following months, Ricardo frequented Gascon 329th Street in the Almagro neighborhood. Every day he looked at the sign that welcomed him. There he could see the name of the company of which his surname was a part. It was the year 1997, and Ricardo believed he understood that the Fords could do nothing but participate in this huge business. For the first time, Carlos believed he had his son in the palm of his hand. He didn't know that Ricardo had an ace up his sleeve. His days in Miami had given the young man a more innovative view of certain things. Before they could tell him no, he set about giving the brand a breath of fresh air. He computerized spreadsheets and inventories, and by the time everyone realized, they were modernized. Carlos nodded slowly, surprised but approving. That was the beginning. After proving to his father that he was willing to take this seriously, Ricardo proposed a new product. Something he had seen in the United States that was not yet common in the lands of soccer and mate. It was about cereal bars. The eldest of the Fords was suspicious. A cereal bar could not be a candy. Or could it? With some trepidation, the first investments were made and the results left everyone astounded. In less than a month, the sales of Felford's cereal bars, the first in Argentina, had broken all established records. Taking advantage of the fact that his father could no longer underestimate him or tell him that he was not good at doing business, Ricardo told the man that he and his partner, a guy named Gustavo, wanted to become parents. Carlos silently paid for the surrogate pregnancy carried out in California. From that transaction, where Ford chose an egg donor, the twins Felipe and Marta would be born. Ricardo chose the names of the children, thinking of his always beloved mother and grandfather. In some way, he had entered the business that had always been sponsored for him and had taken charge of taking the family tree to a new level. In 2004, the war between Ricardo and Carlos definitively ended. Or at least, it was a truce that lasted until they could no longer continue arguing. And in 2007, the 83-year-old businessman left his home and never returned. Carlos used to be absent for days. Sometimes he spent entire days at his factory, a place he considered his home. He would sometimes get lost there, living a double life known to all but never discussed, oblivious to his family. On that occasion, however, the absence became longer than usual. and both his children and his wife started calling hospitals and police stations, trying to see if the man had gotten into any trouble. They suspected a kidnapping, but no one knew anything about Carlos. He had smoked until he got to the Ford mansion, a call from the morgue. They had found a body and feared it might be the recently missing person. Although he was the youngest, Ricardo proposed to be the one to go and verify if they had really found his father dead, or if it was a misunderstanding. No one stopped him, and that's how he found himself in front of a stretcher with a covered lump. When the doctor pulled back the sheets, Ricardo saw Carlos's face, and for once his father's gaze was not judgmental. Upon inquiring about how he had gotten there, Ricardo learned something that would shock him. His father had passed away while having relations with his mistress, a woman with whom he appeared to be a different person. With her, he abandoned his elegant suits and pretended to be a much less powerful person than he really was. To make sure the woman never suspected anything, he hadn't even told her his real name. He called himself Ricardo. The real one never knew how to take that. Did his father use his name when he wanted to be free, when he was happy? Really? Was it some kind of strange tribute? Carlos Ford, the impeccable family man who could never let out an I love you to his children. The man who in his leisure deals played at being a taxidermist and had deer, buffalo, and even elephant heads in his company, was no longer in this world. Ricardo, for his part, was about to turn 40 and knew that a great weight was leaving him. He knew that an invisible shackle was finally breaking. He knew immediately that it was time to resume the dream he had put on hold. He had nothing left that he feared, the artist. Back then, YouTube wasn't the monetization powerhouse it is now. Even so, was that platform chosen by Ricardo Ford to become independent? Determined to resume his fight to be an artist, the man told himself that he would not depend again on someone trusting him. Now he had part of an inheritance that belonged to him, and while his brothers took care of the family business, he decided that it was time to go for all or nothing. He piloted a reality show showcasing his life. However, he was no longer willing to tolerate the producers back and forth. He wanted no more promises or delays. With the death of his father, a kind of obsession with the end of his own days had also been uncovered in Ricardo. He was certain he wouldn't age and never tired of saying it. That's why, when the moment came that everything seemed to stagnate again, he decided that he would be his own producer, also his own director and the leading actor of his life. His reality show quickly gained a niche audience. In each broadcast, Ricardo showed himself in the gym, partying, in expensive restaurants, or simply living life without anything prohibiting him from enjoying. There was ostentation in everything he showed, of course, but there was also a strange human side. As if he himself knew that all that glamour that so defined him and he liked was nothing more than a silly mirage. Ricardo was also impulsive and could go from making jokes to appearing erratic and prone to staring into nothingness. He would go from being hyperproductive to getting lost in mental abysses. He appeared addicted to superficial frivolity, but was unafraid to show his weak and profound side. There was a pose, but also a request. There was a search, an urgent need. Everyone who approached the material consumed it. At first like someone who watches, a kind of parody, then for some reason it became addictive. As a result, the show secured a midnight time slot on Argentine television. And the rest is history. No one could escape Ford's influence and strange charisma. That happened to the daughters of a successful Argentine television host, for instance. The girls showed the material to their father, and that was a before and after. The successful host in question was Marcelo Tinelli. When Tinelli saw that man dancing, singing, traveling, and arguing with his teams of muscular and oiled bodyguards, he knew there was a product that could seduce the masses, and he was not wrong. Ford was called to be a dancer in a contest that was leading the ratings. He was no longer the shy boy who had participated in Miami television. His brief appearances were sufficient to garner both fans and critics. On one hand, there were those who accused him of having gotten there just because he was a person of money and nothing more. Others saw him as a breath of fresh air within the always closed and suffocating circle of television. Ford, a new character, created his own controversies, becoming a vortex that absorbed everything. Being so exposed made him obsess more and more with his figure, so the operating rooms, which had never been foreign to his life, multiplied their interference in him. He had surgery on his spine, he had surgery on his heels to be taller, and when he injured his knees, he refused to take the rest that everyone suggested. As he said, now that he had reached where he had always wanted to be, he could not afford to rest. The next year, he judged the contest where he had previously excelled, and the controversies surrounding his figure did nothing but increase. Journalists knew they had a personality to squeeze. Everyone predicted that people would quickly get bored of his face, but Ford knew how to stay relevant. Despite living his dream, he smiled even less than before. He would later discover that being under the spotlight was plunging him into the thickest darkness. And that's how our story comes back to the beginning. Difficult years. Ricardo had his own late-night show, premiered large-scale works, had clothing brands and fragrances with his name. He liked to present himself as a person aware of his privileges, but then he acted like a dictator with his employees. Suddenly there was something of his father in him, something that went beyond the surname. He squandered his fortune and laughed at those who said his circle was using him. The media were also merciless with his sexuality. Ricardo preferred to be seen with women, but they always wanted him to come out of the closet. It was the only thing he seemed to want to keep private, as if Carlos's shame still resonated like an echo within him. After being pursued by all the paparazzi, he had no choice but to admit his bisexuality. Not stopping led him to become addicted to morphine, and this addiction in turn led to other organs of his being affected. He almost died from peritonitis due to a perforation in the duodenum, and admitted, already broken, that he had even thought about taking his own life. In recent times, he spoke openly about the 16 titanium screws that were in his back, of the unbearable pain he lived second by second. He said that the doctors had ruined his life, that many, in order to cash their checks, had recommended surgeries that only damaged him more and more. When he traveled from Miami with a femur fracture, he was deteriorated and was seen in a wheelchair. When asked if it was true they amputated his leg, he got angry. At that moment, he realized that they had fed a beast that now didn't want to let him go. His meteoric rise and thunderous fall concluded on Friday, November 22, 2013, when he provided closure to those curious about him. He passed away on Monday the 25th. He was only 45 years old and had suffered a cardiac arrest, a result of a generalized infection and massive internal bleeding. A medical board determined a few days later that there had been no malpractice. The blow was unexpected. As quickly as Ricardo had appeared, he was gone. Even though he wanted his ashes to be scattered from the top of the obelisk, his family buried him in a private cemetery. When his life went out, it was as if a hurricane suddenly stopped. Argentinian television had become so accustomed to his presence that when he was gone, there was a kind of disarray. It was only 5 years, but 5 years that redefined a medium that prided itself on controlling everything. While Ford was consumed by his ambition, he also managed to leave a distinct mark on his kind in his own way. Aspects of his flawed but sincere character endured and are now commemorated in memes and various forms bearing his likeness. He's almost a caricature of himself, but also a reminder. An anti-hero, in short, harmless, who, according to his dearest, was only looking for some of that affection that had always eluded him. Those who survived him continued with their string of scandals, but these were scandals that soon dissolved along with so many others. The cornerstone of that empire was Ford himself, a man who at one point was accused of being naive. The reasons. He had said, and I quote, "I always thought that fame is for teaching something, or for changing minds, or opening minds. Fame to appear in magazines or on television is empty. Fame allows you to influence people's ideas and ways of thinking. I always aspired to be famous for that reason." We cannot say that he has not achieved it, although it is true that his legacy is as unclassifiable as his life was. A life that was full of shadows, but also of an immeasurable light. Mom, you cut off all the light. You touched something I touched there. They must fix that, as it cannot remain this way. Thank you.